IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. The global pandemic has caused us all to work from home, and so if this episode sounds a little different to you, it's because we're all sitting in little corners of our homes on little desks and trying to do this remotely. Today, we want to talk about Russia, Russia's place in the world, how it sees its place in the world, whether there's a method to what it does. Recently, President Vladimir Putin of Russia signed a law that could theoretically keep him in power for another 16 years. This also happens at a time when Russia is heavily involved in the Middle East, in North Africa and Libya, as well as in Ukraine. Russia has also allegedly interfered in America's presidential election in 2016. There are all sorts of stories about Russian interference in the politics of Western Europe. So Russia is frequently viewed today as this resurgent power. But why is Russia doing all this? Is there an underlying philosophy? To discuss this with me, I have Anirudh Kanisetti. We want to get into some of the musings of a well-known Russian geopolitical thinker. But before we do that, I want to just talk briefly about some of his intellectual predecessors. In 1904, British academic Halford Mackinder delivered a lecture titled The Geographical Pivot of History. I'm sure some of you have heard of this paper. Basically, at the core of his argument was the idea that technology was tilting the balance of power in favor of continental states. Now, remember, this comes at 1904. This is at the height of British power. And yet, at the same time, Mackinder had the sense that the era of the maritime powers was fading. The way he put it, the Columbian epoch was coming to an end. There were no more lands to discover, no more new colonies to be had. This was a world in which the earth had really become a closed system, and geography had to be understood very much now as a social science. And what Mackinder said was that technology was actually changing conditions. In the decades before this famous lecture, you'd already seen steamships, for example, really shrinking the globe, changing the nature of navigation. You would think that this would give a huge advantage to maritime states. But in fact, Mackinder pointed out that if you look at especially the railway, the railway really changed conditions in the heartland, especially in the steppe. As he put it, this actually transmuted the conditions of these lands. So Mackinder's lecture was well received and so on. And he really solidified his views and changed them in some pretty significant ways in 1919 with a new book called Democratic Ideals and Reality. Now, remember, this is 1919. Germany's rise, as it turns out, has not been peaceful, and you've just had a world war, and countries are trying to reconstruct a peace. 1919 is the time of the negotiations in Paris for a new treaty. And Mackinder at this time actually argues that besides there being a geographical pivot in Europe, there's actually a sort of heartland, an inner Europe, an inner Eurasia, really, which is really the heartland of the world. And there's this famous pithy aphorism that he has that who rules the heartland rules the world island, meaning the whole Eurasian landmass. So that's both the heartland, rimland around it. And so sometimes Mackinder's views, which are actually quite complex and subtle, have been simplified by people. Mackinder did see, for example, Europe as being somewhat unique. And yet at the same time, he pointed out that European history was deeply affected by what happened in Asia. The way he saw it, Europe was really stuck between a mortar and a pestle, especially Western Europe. On the one hand, you had the hordes of the Mongols, of Attila, and so on, constantly pounding at the doors of Western Europe, and on the other end, you had the sea. And Europe eventually found, according to Mackinder, this outlet in the sea. If you look at a map of Western Europe, it's an extraordinarily jagged coastline. It's actually a very long coastline. And it was from this coastline, of course, that you had the so-called Columbian epoch. You had the expansion of Europeans all over the world. And yet at the same time, Mackinder said, our idea that you can have this maritime state and be extremely powerful despite being a small country is kind of delusional, because really a lot of maritime power is undergirded by your strength on land, the resources you have on land, and how you can mobilize them.
It's very interesting to me to think of the kind of scale at which Mackinder is looking at the world. He's looking at the entire Afro-Eurasian landmass as essentially one enormous world system. Right? And it's a world system of such a population density, such economic prosperity, that really the New World kind of pales in comparison. I also find it an interesting mental exercise to kind of think about Europe as essentially being the tail end of the world, right? Because you can see how all the peoples of Eurasia, all the great movements of the steppe hordes are basically funneled from east towards the west. But also you see the great economic movements of global history being funneled from the east towards the west. You see a lot of the great innovations, technological innovations, going from the east towards the west. And all of these build up in Europe over the centuries, right? So there's a lot of factors going into Europe's eventual rise and dominance over the world. It's a lot more complicated than broadly the steppe horde essentially forcing the Europeans to take to the seas, as Kinder's making it out to be.
Yeah, absolutely. We do now understand much better the interconnectedness of these lands and how Europe actually benefited from technologies from other parts of the world. But Mackinder is actually part of, I think, a broader academic awakening that, for instance, recognized that Greek civilization, for example, owed a great debt to other civilizations of the Mediterranean. And he did understand that Europe was not necessarily in a pilot's seat in history until fairly recently. So, in a sense, it's part of actually a broader intellectual evolution that we're seeing in the early 20th century. Like I said, Mackinder actually believed that to have a durable peace in Europe, the one thing you don't want is for a large Germany and for Russia to be friends. And he also preferred to see a sort of fragmented Europe. So, you don't want a unified German empire. You want Britain to be providing security guarantees to a newly independent Poland. And of course, we all know how that worked out in 1939.
If we can just pause for a second and kind of connect that to the world island idea. If you imagine that we're looking at the world from the North Pole, you just imagine that you're looking down at the great Eurasian landmass, right? So you're looking at the whole sweep of Russia. You're seeing the Arctic. You're seeing Scandinavia, and further as you look towards the west, you see Germany. And what Mackinder is basically saying is that you need to ensure that the broad landmass that includes Germany and Russia is not connected, is not basically allied with each other against the rest of the world, because that would be something that the rest of the world would be absolutely unable to fight back against. So, which is why he was basically pushing for Britain to ensure that Poland was kept independent at all costs. But the Germans and Russians basically made a deal and divided Poland between them, which, as you can imagine, must have absolutely freaked Mackinder out.
Yeah, exactly. And what's really interesting about all this is that it runs almost countercurrent to a lot of the popular historiography of the two world wars. Even in 1919, this was the time of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, for example, a very idealistic sense of how you want to reconstruct the world after this great war. And yet Mackinder is someone who argues that you have to work within the realities of the system. You do need to apply these ideas about geography and power politics in order to ensure peace. So in that sense, he was defiantly unfashionable. It's also really interesting that we look at the Second World War as a geopolitical contest. Sometimes it's really made out to be this gigantic responsibility to protect humanitarian intervention, which it absolutely was not. And it's really in the Second World War that this idea that the heartland is going to be crucial to human history gains traction. And of course, that's the time that it's really after 1945 that you see this new resurgence of the Soviet Union. Now, Soviet Union, you have this contest between the Soviet Union on the one hand and the United States, which is both a continental power and a maritime power. It's something in between. It's a strange beast of its own. And if you look at the Cold War really as a contest between maritime powers and continental powers, and the values of maritime powers and the values of continental powers, it gives you a very different perspective of the period. And the idea that, in a sense, the maritime powers have continued to triumph. The very fact that we continue to speak English, that is one of the most widely spoken language in the world, seems to be some sort of evidence that the maritime powers continue to triumph in a sense. But obviously there's clear pushback to this, especially from Russia, and to the value judgments that are attached to both being a maritime power and a continental power. And this is where, Anirudh, I want to bring in Alexander Dugin. How does he see the world, and how is his worldview different from this?
Okay, so for a little bit of context, Alexander Dugin is a very, very influential Russian, quote unquote, geopolitician. His writings really look at Russian culture as being integral in some ways to the Russian nation. And it's kind of tied to a broader intellectual movement that happened in Imperial Russia in the early 19th century. So, Aditya, you mentioned civilizations of land and sea. So, Dugin actually takes that, and it's kind of interesting to see how it contrasts with the way that Mackinder sees history. Because Dugin attaches value judgments to these civilizations of land and civilizations of sea. So when he looks at, for example, the Peloponnesian Wars, which were these great wars between the Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta, which led massive alliances, he chooses to interpret it as a paradigm of the conflict between civilizations of land and sea, with the land being exemplified by Sparta, which exemplifies a certain kind of military ethos, a certain kind of celibacy, belief in the collective, a certain kind of martial manliness. Whereas Athens represents the civilization of the sea, which is more libertine, more individualistic, more capitalistic, and just generally less effective militarily. And he applies the same logic to the conflict of Rome and Carthage, saying that Rome epitomizes the values of civilization of land, Carthage represents the values of civilization of sea. And the way that he sees it, if you look at the broad span of Eurasian history, it's really the Romans and then the Russians who exemplify the ethos of the civilization of land. There's a few issues with the historical basis of what Dugin is saying.
This does seem to me to be a bit of a simplification of history. Some of this may be inevitable when you're trying to make such a case, but I do want to point out that, for instance, a lot of the ideas about Spartan martial prowess are propaganda. Now, it's obvious now, obviously, because the Spartans were full-time soldiers, their infantry were feared. But the Spartans did not have some magic formula for victory. There were frequently occasions in which they lost. The other thing is Sparta didn't actually just win the Peloponnesian War with its infantry. It really went out to sea. And it's really the mobilization of its sea resources. It's the creation of a navy from the scratch that really tips the scales and allows them to win against the Athenians.
And the same applies to the victory of the Romans over the Carthaginians. If you look at the First Punic War, for example, and it's actually kind of interesting how both conflicts between superpowers,
Yes.
both these conflicts between superpowers happen over the island of Sicily, isn't it? So the Romans managed to get the upper hand in the First Punic War, the first war against the Carthaginians, by adapting their naval tactics. So they actually introduced this interesting this little innovation called the Corvis Bridge. It's this bridge that's attached to the deck of their ships, which they basically drop down onto the decks of any ship that's next to them. It's got a massive nail at the bottom of it that impales the enemy ship and basically transforms every sea battle into a land battle. So in both these cases, right, in both these clashes, what's happening is that the superpower that wins is the one that really innovates, not necessarily the one that has a particular kind of ethos. And it's also really up to question to what extent you can say that the Romans believed in the collective versus the individual, right? While to an extent there was a belief in the Roman Republic and lip service was paid to it by every politician, we also know the Roman society could be absolutely as individualistic, as materialistic, and as corrupt as any other society. And as a superpower, it actually tended to be far more hedonistic, far more driven by the corruption and greed of individual people than the average ancient state might have been.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought up the First Punic War and the Corvus, because the Corvus, like you said, is a way of turning naval battles into land battles. So, in a sense, the Romans are returning to their comfort zone. But if you look at the struggle that follows the Second Punic War, it's primarily a land war. So, again, the idea that you can very easily classify these countries as maritime powers or land powers, doesn't actually sit easily with the complexities of history. If you look at the greatest maritime power.
And just for a bit of context, in the Second Punic War, it was Carthage that was leading the war against Rome, and it was a Carthaginian general that was actually really innovating with tactics on land. So you can see how in the First Punic War, it's Rome that learns how to fight on sea. In the Second Punic War, it's Carthage that tries to dominate on land. It's kind of interesting to see how that contrast unfolds.
If you look even at the maritime powers today, if you look at, for instance, the greatest maritime power of our time, which is the United States, it is both, like I said, a continental power and a maritime power. It's both things. Now, of course, there are some countries, some states which are quintessential maritime powers. We've actually talked about this in an episode last year, and we'll provide a link in the episode description. But for instance, you look at Venice, you look also at Carthage, Athens, you look at Britain itself. These are exemplars of maritime powers, at least in the Western world. You do see some sort of replication of the idea of sea states or sea power states. These are all ideas from a maritime historian named Andrew Lambert. You do see them, for example, in Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan. These are small countries or entities which are actually a lot wealthier and more powerful than you would normally expect. So there is this, I think, very persistent and resilient idea about maritime power. So basically, if you ask proponents of maritime power, they would actually share Alexander Dugin's broad structure, but they would reverse the value judgments. They would say that they're what Alexander Dugin calls libertines is really about individualism and democracy and so on. So I think you do see these guys creating a mirror image of each other. Now, to just continue with this examination of historical simplifications, Anirudh, how does Dugin connect Rome so easily with Russia?
So what he does is essentially make this very neat and convenient transition from late medieval Rome to late medieval Russia, which is problematic on a lot of levels.
Hang on. When you talk about late medieval Rome, you mean what we normally call Byzantine?
Yes, the Byzantine Empire, which even though it's called something different, this polity which basically spans Greece and modern day Turkey, and for a lot of its existence, Syria and Egypt as well, should be considered to be the medieval survivor of Rome, right? So it's essentially the Eastern Roman Empire that survives, that continues to evolve with the rest of the world around it. Fascinating polity. So what happens by the late 9th century or so is that there's increasing interconnectedness between the Ukraine region and Byzantium, or really the Eastern Roman Empire, as I'm going to call it through the rest of this podcast. And what happens is that the Ukrainians, or as they were called then, the Rus Vikings, offered themselves as mercenaries in service of the Byzantine emperor. There's centuries of interaction that continues to happen after this. So essentially, Constantinople becomes a destination for young Vikings, young Rus Vikings, to come and prove themselves, to serve as mercenaries, gain some military experience before going back and becoming warlords, basically. Quite a lot of famous historical figures actually served as these so-called Varangian guards, these bodyguards to the Byzantine emperors. One of them including, of course, Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway, who temporarily wanted to rule over England. What a very, very interesting characters. But coming back to the broader sweep of history, right? So this interaction's happening over centuries, there's trade happening, and There's also migrations of other peoples that's happening within the broader world system. You have the Turks actually entering Anatolia, which is actually why, as we know, why Turkey is now called Turkey, because Turks came from Central Asia and settled down there, defeating the Romans who actually ruled over it. And what happens is that there's a steady decline in the power of the Romans, while there's a steady increase in the power of the Rus Vikings, or as they start to call themselves, the Russians. And this is kind of exemplified by a power called the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, which by the late 15th century manages to defeat all the other states in that broad area and emerge as the primary power of the region. Its rise is kind of aided by the invasions of the Mongols. So the Mongols clean out all the other former powerhouses and enable Muscovy to rise up as a vassal state in the rubble that basically remains. But by the 15th century, as I said, Muscovy starts to like really throw off the shackles of Mongol dominance and emerge into its own, right? And also the Tsar of Muscovy, as he starts to call himself, Tsar being a word that's derived from Kaiser, which is Caesar, as we would pronounce it in English. So clearly, he's trying to call himself a Roman emperor, but transplanting that locus of power, as it were, from Constantinople, where it is for him. So think about it. He's calling the emperor at Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor, as we would think about it. He's calling him the Roman emperor, and now he's calling him an equal. He's calling himself an equal. He's saying that he is a Tsar. This guy is actually married to a cousin of the last Roman emperor. So the Constantinople is then taken over by the Ottoman Turks and becomes Istanbul. But from then on, Muscovy, or as it starts to call itself, Russia, now starts to call itself the Third Rome. And it adopts the double-headed eagle as its imperial standard, that the double-headed imperial eagle being the same standard as that of the last imperial family of Rome. All these transitions are really contingent on a lot of factors, right? You can see there's really a lot of individual ambition, a lot of politics, a lot of probability, a lot of risk and response and reward that goes into all this. And a lot of it really depends on the fate of the Mongols. The Mongols are the key deciding factor here. Without the fall of the Mongols, you would never have seen the rise of the Russians.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me that Dugin traces the origins of this quintessential land power not from the Mongol Golden Horde, but from the rise of Muscovy. Does he provide a justification for this?
So, though he mentions the Mongols, he mentions the Central Asian nomadic powers as having controlled the steppe for some time, but for some reason never really dives into them as trying to understand them as a civilization in their own right. And I think that's really where you can start to see his so-called quote-unquote academic rigor falling apart, because it seems that this is based on nothing other than a racist sort of insistence that the Russians are the true inheritors of Rome, and also kind of choosing Rome as somehow being the prime example of civilizations of land without even looking at the great civilizations of the rest of the world, which for most of history, in terms of population, in terms of density of the economy, far outranked Europe.
I'm really curious about the absence, of Persia, which did interact with parts of what is now today Russia, as well as China. Both of them seem to be absent from this narrative, right?
It's kind of difficult not to see a certain kind of racist undertone in his insistence on Russian superiority, and most importantly, his connection with Imperial Rome, right? Because that's kind of what you see in most fascist playbooks, this connection to a great historical empire. We saw that really with the Nazis, we saw that with the Italians, and you can kind of see in a lot of ways how Russia, with its history really of its own political leaders, its own Tsars, deliberately going out of their way to connect themselves to Imperial Rome. You can see how that would appeal to a fascist who was looking at Russian history. You can see how that lens would kind of influence their worldview.
I'm not quite sure that the Russian czars actually took this Third Rome rhetoric as seriously as Dugin imagines.
Absolutely, they're shrewd politicians just like any other imperial power.
Yeah, exactly. But it's really interesting to trace the expansion of the Russian Empire really from this kernel around Moscow, you see this vast expansion. They're constantly pushing back against the Mongols. They're expanding actually in every direction. They're expanding north, west, south, east. And eventually, as they consolidate their power, they've actually reached into Eastern Europe. They're dominating what is today Ukraine. And by the 19th century, the Russians start pushing into Central Asia. So a lot of the former Soviet republics of today, whether it's Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, all of these lands had by the late 19th century come under Russian domination or direct rule. So you can see a massive expansion of this really unprecedented continental power. If you look at Russia today, it has coastlines on both the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. Now, it's a very fragmented coastline, so that does create problems for Russia when it's trying to build maritime power. But even in the midst of this great continental expansion, it's not like the Russians are not thinking about the sea. I think the figure that really exemplifies this is Peter the Great. This is a man who actually essentially creates a new capital, St. Petersburg. It's on the sea. It's by the sea, and it's part of a broader project to actually create sea power. So the Russians do understand the importance of sea power, and they also, at the same time, are expanding deep into the heart of Eurasia. So there is, even in Russia, some amount of push and pull, even if this is weighted heavily in favor of a continental identity, and that continental identity really underpins this Russia's view of themselves.
I think that really the history of cartography, the history of biology, owe a lot to the Russian Empire's efforts to expand through land and sea, right, through the 18th, 19th centuries. Though, of course, as most imperialist efforts go, its expansion was extremely violent and aided, of course, by the fact it was using gunpowder that was developed in Europe. So what Russia was doing was basically arbitraging, as it were. Europe, over the course of centuries, had basically gathered technological advances that had been done in the rest of the world, managed to advance to a certain level, and Russia, by leveraging its position as being broadly next to Europe, was able to kind of use that to expand into Central Asia. Now, you can see this in multiple ways, right? You can kind of understand how Dugin can look at this and say that, look, clearly, look at the extraordinary expansion of Rome, this land power, since I've defined land power in a certain way, which is even though it's absolutely historical. You can see how, given this lens, given this view of Russia, you can see how this Russian expansion into Central Asia can be seen as a continuation of that legacy. But as I pointed out, you can also see a technological explanation for this. You can also question to what extent Russians at the time, as you pointed out, Aditya, to what extent did SARS actually believe in this? To what extent the Russian people actually believe that they're the inheritors of Rome? To what extent was it basically a convenient fiction that was propped out, just like if you look at the architecture of, for example, Victoria Memorial in Kolkata, if you look at the statues there, you can clearly see there's a Roman influence there. But all of these are clearly affectations, right? These are all meant to kind of provide this legitimacy through a certain kind of architecture, through a certain kind of cultural callback. But that doesn't necessarily explain anything about the logic of imperial expansion, which is usually tied to much deeper societal factors, much deeper economic factors, especially the rise of certain classes. You can kind of see the rise of serfdom in Russia within this context, right? You can see the great movements of the late 19th, early 20th century within this context. And you really need to see the rise of communism within this context. The way that the grand sweep of Russian history has unfolded has a lot more to do than simply the entire society going through a certain kind of golden age when they all shared a certain kind of ethos that led to this glorious expansion. Because this expansion period in Russian history wasn't great for all Russians. It was an absolutely terrible period for the serfs, who were basically property, who were owned by the aristocrats, who could not move around of their own volition, and who often suffered absolutely horrendous casualties when they were pressed into armies to fight invaders such as Napoleon, or even to fight in wars that Russia happened to field deeper inland in Europe or with the Ottoman Empire.
Exactly. I'm actually surprised that that Russia's imperial age can be thought of as a golden era. I'm really curious as to how Dugin sees the communist period, because if you'd asked Mackinder in 1919, what he was looking at was, for instance, Lenin's promise of mass industrialization, and he believed that this would actually really feed into Soviet/Russian power. How does Dugin see this period really from 1917 to 1991?
Now, interestingly enough, Dugin also sees this as a golden age because, as far as he's concerned, as long as it's a Russian state that's doing the expanding, doesn't matter whether it's communist or imperialist or whatever.
So you have a right-wing ideologue singing praises of the Soviet Union.
Basically, yes, because the Soviet Union does everything that basically ticks all of the boxes on Dugin's geopolitical checklist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, as far as this guy is concerned, any Soviet leader who was strong, who managed to expand into Central Asia, managed to secure resources for Russia, basically was helping maintain this broader balance of civilizations of land and sea. Civilization of land, of course, being exemplified by the USSR, and the civilization of sea being exemplified by the USA. So the way that he sees it, the Cold War should be seen as basically these two paradigms of their respective civilizations trying to exercise control over the rim land, which is the land that borders both land and sea. And as far as he was concerned, as far as the Soviet Union was powerful, it was able to maintain this balance. But the civilization of sea now, the USA, because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, has managed to take control of most of the rim land, which he interprets as basically there being more democracies, there being more free trade, and so on and so forth in the rest of the world. Basically, the world following American value systems. And as far as he's concerned, Russia needs to basically restore the values of the civilization of land within itself, restore it to its periphery, restore it to its historical areas of influence, and once again rise to balance the civilization of the sea.
Yeah. So you see over here a sense where domestic order is very intimately linked with your geopolitical power, your power in the international sphere. This is not unique to Dugin. If you ask a lot of thinkers in, for instance, the United States, even today, a lot of sensible people will tell you that. They'll tell you that their domestic order fundamentally influences the way they see the world. Okay, so now, Anirudh, the Soviet Union is history. Russian power has, since 1991, really contracted, even though we're seeing some sort of partial resurgence today. Why do Dugin's views have traction in Russia today? And do they really explain what Vladimir Putin is doing?
Well, I think it's an interesting debate to have, right? I think if you look at China, for example, all of a sudden in academia, there's a sudden rise in references to the concept of Tianxia, for example, or the concept of the Middle Kingdom, the idea that the Chinese see themselves as exceptional, they see themselves as being the center of the world, and that the rest of the world should be tributaries to them, and that somehow the BRI is linked to this. But you can also choose to interpret it as something else. You can choose to interpret it as Xi Jinping wanting to respond to certain kind of domestic political imperatives, wanting to use Chinese overcapacity in a certain way, and seeing a convenient outlet for it, one that isn't necessarily fulfilling all of the broader strategic objectives that it's supposed to fulfill.
Yeah.
So there's multiple ways of looking at a lot of this. And especially, I think that's the case with Russia. I think a much, much better way to look at Russia is to think of it as basically an opportunistic and revisionist power that does genuinely, to some extent, have memories of great power ambitions, but also to a greater extent has a domestic political economy that is geared towards activities that we interpret as being suitable for a great power. But if you look at its economy, for example, it isn't necessarily doing that well. You can look at Putin's declaration, essentially his reset of the presidential term counter to zero as perhaps being a move that's coming out of weakness. There's a lot of ways of looking at the same issue is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I really think that this attempt by both Russia and China to find some sort of roots to their thinking in antiquity is maybe perhaps also reflected to some extent in India among people who sometimes ahistorically invoke the Arthashastra. But it's really an interesting trend which is clearly tied to trying to establish political legitimacy in the present.
So I don't really know how much currency these kind of interpretations even have outside of academia. Like, I don't know if you can really manufacture domestic legitimacy with your average voter by going and telling them that, hey, you know what, I'm doing what Kautilya recommended that India do 5,000 years ago. So this is why you should be voting for me. I kind of feel like it's part of the broader process of discourse building, especially revisionist powers that are trying to manufacture legitimacy, do engage in systematically. I think that's a much better way of seeing both China's of seeing all these concepts. I think the best way to see them is that all these the sudden resurgence of all these concepts is because of resurgent powers that basically seek to that turn to history to manufacture legitimacy in a totally different international context.
I agree. I think that Halford Mackinder, for all his limitations and for all the things that he got wrong, would actually be pretty appalled by this sort of simplistic, ideologically driven models of geopolitics. I think he had a much more subtle mind, and he would have actually come up with some pretty interesting ideas if he was alive today. And those ideas would probably be very different from the ideas he had in 1919 or 1904. Well, on that note, Anirudh, thank you so much. It's been an awesome discussion. We hope to continue having such discussions again in the future. If you have a comment or anything, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, HDFC Life and Paytm Money. Also, just a very quick note, I would really appreciate it if you guys could fill out a really short survey on our website. It's on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It's just a brand recognition survey for us to kind of work with the advertisers and give them some data. So it's a very short, less than 1 minute survey. Really appreciate your help in filling it out. And let me tell you a couple of things that you should check out this week. On IVM Likes, Alika, Antriksh and Sumit talk about some weird and bizarre shows and movies that they've seen. On Geek Fruit, Tejas and Dinkar just saw Pixar's new movie Onward. Tune in to find out what they thought of it. On the Empowering series, Zarina is joined by Rohit Taparia, Vice President of Isprava and Lohono Stays. They talk about the journey of an entrepreneur in the luxury home segment. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam talks with Kalpen Parekh, President at DSP Mutual Fund, about various frameworks of mutual funds. On Absolutely Right, Aditya is joined by Rachel Lopez. They dive into her personality by analyzing her handwriting. Thanks and keep listening.
Welcome to Peak Planet, a new podcast where we delve into the fallouts of the growth path that we and indeed much of the world has chosen. Sustainable growth is the buzzword. Until we nail that down, we need to ensure that we keep our population healthy and also have the resources for our increasingly urban lifestyles. I'm Karthik Ganesan, a researcher at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, a Delhi-based policy research institute where for almost a decade we've been trying to explain and change the use, reuse and misuse of our resources. In the first season of Peak Planet, we take up air pollution, public enemy number one, and an invisible one at that. Increasingly, the most important risk factor for adverse health outcomes, air pollution has become the most unwanted byproduct for an aggressively growing economy. Over 4 episodes, we find out how prepared our systems are to deal with this crisis. You can catch the entire first season of Peak Planet out now on the IVM Podcasts app or website, or wherever you get your podcasts from.